James Thornton knew the foal was dying the moment he found her buried in snow, her mother's corpse frozen beside her. What he couldn't know was that saving this one small life would cost him everything he'd spent 8 years building, his carefully guarded heart. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The storm came down from the mountains like the wrath of God himself, turning the Wyoming sky from pale winter blue to bruised purple in the span of 20 minutes. James Thornton stood on the covered porch of his ranch house, watching the first fat snowflakes begin their descent, each one the size of a silver dollar, floating lazily at first before the wind caught them and turned the whole world into a whirling chaos of white. He'd seen storms like this before, the kind that could bury a man and his horse in less than an hour, the kind that separated the prepared from the foolish with brutal efficiency. At 42, James had built the largest cattle operation in 3 territories, transforming his father's modest homestead into an empire that stretched across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land. His success had come from equal parts hard work and instinct, the ability to read weather patterns and market fluctuations with the same careful attention he gave to his prize breeding stock. The Thornton Ranch was known from Denver to San Francisco, his Hereford cattle commanding top dollar at every auction, his business acumen the subject of admiring conversation in gentlemen's clubs and investment halls throughout the West. Yet for all his wealth and influence, James Thornton remained fundamentally a rancher, a man more comfortable in worn leather and dusty denim than the fine suits that hung unused in his bedroom wardrobe. His hands bore the calluses of rope work and fence mending, and his face carried the deep lines carved by decades of prairie sun and wind. He was a handsome man still, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvering at the temples, and eyes the color of storm clouds that seemed to see through pretense and false promises with uncomfortable accuracy. Women in town had set their caps for him over the years, widows and unmarried daughters alike, drawn by his wealth and the lonely tragedy that hung about him like morning mist. But James had remained stubbornly, resolutely alone in the 8 years since Margaret's death. His wife had been taken by fever in the winter of 1873, leaving him with a 10-room house that echoed with her absence and a heart he had carefully walled off against further loss. He told himself he was content with his work, his horses, the satisfaction of building something lasting from the unforgiving land. But on nights like this, when storms reminded him of all the evenings Margaret had waited for him to come in from the cold, the loneliness felt like a living thing, coiled tight beneath his ribs. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the porch boards and sending snow swirling in devil's spirals across the yard. James pulled his coat tighter and was about to retreat inside when something caught his attention, a sound beneath the howl of the wind that didn't belong to the storm. It was high-pitched and desperate, the kind of cry that spoke of pain and fear in equal measure. He stilled, his rancher's instincts immediately alert, straining to hear above nature's fury. There it was again, coming from the direction of the northern pasture, where his breeding mares were supposed to be safely sheltered in the barn. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat from the hook by the door, pulled on his leather gloves, and reached for the lantern that always sat ready on the porch rail. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour, and the wind cut through layers of clothing like a knife through warm butter. He lowered his head against the assault and started toward the barn, his boots crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep and accumulating fast. The journey that normally took 3 minutes stretched into 10 as he fought his way through blinding white curtains that reduced visibility to mere feet. The lantern was almost useless, its light swallowed by the storm, but he knew this land like he knew his own heartbeat, had walked these paths in darkness and daylight for more than 30 years. When he finally reached the barn, he found the heavy doors standing open, banging against their frames in the wind, his gut clenched with worry. Young Tom, his newest ranch hand, had been responsible for securing the horses before the storm hit, and the boy had sworn everything was battened down tight. James pushed inside, grateful for the relative shelter, and raised his lantern to survey the stalls. The breeding mares were there, shifting nervously in their boxes, their dark eyes reflecting the lamplight with an almost supernatural gleam. He counted them quickly, his practiced eye moving from one familiar form to another, and his heart sank when he came up one short. Snowdrop was missing, the white mare who had been heavily pregnant and due to foal any day now. The cry came again, clearer now without the wind to distort it, and James recognized it immediately. That was a foal, young and terrified, calling for help that wasn't coming. He moved through the barn with swift efficiency, checking the back stalls and the feed room, anywhere a laboring mare might have sought privacy. Nothing. The cry sounded once more, fainter this time, and James realized with cold certainty that it was coming from outside, from somewhere beyond the barn in the full fury of the storm. He knew he should gather help, wake the hands sleeping in the bunkhouse, organize a proper search party, but the foal's weakening voice told him there wasn't time for proper procedure. Whatever had happened out there in the storm, that baby was running out of time and running out of strength to call for rescue. James checked his coat pockets, making sure he had rope and the sharp folding knife he always carried, then stepped back out into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a physical force, nearly knocking him sideways, and the snow was so thick he could barely see his own hands in front of his face. He oriented himself by memory and instinct, heading north toward the low hills where Snowdrop had liked to graze in the afternoons, where she might have wandered if labor pains had confused her natural homing instinct. The world had become nothing but white noise and stinging ice, each breath burning in his lungs, each step a battle against wind that seemed determined to push him back toward safety. James had faced death before, in the war, and in the hard early years of building his ranch. But there was something particularly ruthless about a Wyoming blizzard, the way it reduced everything to simple mathematics of exposure and endurance. He pushed forward, driven by something more than logic or financial interest in expensive breeding stock. There was life out there in the darkness, young and innocent and in need of help, and James Thornton had never been the kind of man who could turn away from that kind of need, regardless of personal cost. The lantern guttered and died, snuffed out by wind and snow, leaving him in complete darkness except for the faint gray light that filtered through the storm. He dropped it and kept moving, his hands outstretched, calling out for Snowdrop in a voice that was immediately torn away by the wind. Time became meaningless, measured only in the burning of his lungs and the growing numbness in his extremities. He had no idea if he'd been searching for 5 minutes or 50 when his boot struck something soft and yielding, something that shouldn't be there in the empty pasture. Before we continue with what James discovered in that storm, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story's already got you hooked, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something extra special waiting for you. James dropped to his knees beside the dark shape in the snow, his hands already working to clear away the accumulating white that threatened to bury it completely. His fingers, numb despite the thick gloves, touched warm flesh and wet fur, and he felt the faint rise and fall of labored breathing. Snowdrop lay on her side in the snow, her white coat barely distinguishable from the storm around her, her dark eyes rolling in pain and exhaustion. The mare had tried to find her way back to the barn. That much was clear from the trail of disturbed snow that led back toward the hills, but labor had overtaken her, and the storm had done the rest. James ran his hands along her body, feeling for injuries, for breaks or wounds that might explain why she hadn't made it to safety. What he found instead was the unmistakable evidence of birth, the afterbirth steaming in the frigid air, the mare's distended sides already beginning to contract back toward normal. Somewhere in the chaos of the storm, Snowdrop had delivered her foal, and that meant the baby was out here too, small and wet and utterly defenseless against the killing cold. The cry came again, so close now that James realized he must have walked right past the foal in the blinding snow. He moved in the direction of the sound, his hands sweeping through snowdrifts that were already knee-deep in the low spots between hills. His fingers struck something solid but yielding, and then he was digging frantically, clearing snow away from a tiny form that was barely moving, its cries reduced to weak whimpers that would soon stop altogether if he didn't act fast. The foal was perfect, a mirror image of its mother with a pure white coat that was matted and half-frozen, its long legs folded beneath its small body in an instinctive attempt to conserve heat. James pulled off his coat without thinking, wrapping the shivering baby in sheepskin that was still warm from his own body heat. The foal was small enough that he could lift it, though his arms protested at the awkward weight, and he tucked the trembling creature against his chest, trying to shelter it from the worst of the wind. He couldn't save both animals, not in this storm, not alone. The mare was too heavy to move, too weak to walk, and attempting to get her up would likely kill them all. But the foal still had a chance if he could get it back to the barn, get it warm and dry and fed before hypothermia claimed it completely. The decision tore at him. Leaving Snowdrop alone in the storm went against every instinct he possessed, but James had learned long ago that survival on the frontier often meant making impossible choices, saving what could be saved and mourning what couldn't. He bent over the mare, putting his mouth close to her ear despite the wind. "I'll come back for you," he promised, though he knew the odds of finding her alive when the storm cleared were slim at best. "I'll send the men, just hold on." Snowdrop's dark eye found his face for a moment, and he could have sworn he saw understanding there, a mother's desperate hope that her baby might survive even if she didn't. Then he turned away. The foal clutched against his chest and began the brutal journey back toward the ranch. The return trip was a nightmare of cold and confusion, each step a gamble as he navigated by instinct through snow that was now mid-calf, deep and rising fast. The foal's trembling had slowed, which James knew was a bad sign, the small body growing still and quiet in his arms as hypothermia began to shut down its systems one by one. He talked to it as he walked, his voice hoarse and cracking, telling the baby about the warm barn waiting ahead, about the bottles of milk they'd prepare, about the life it would have if it could just hold on a little longer. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, and he went down hard, twisting his body at the last second to take the impact on his shoulder rather than crushing the foal beneath him. Pain exploded through his left side, sharp and immediate, and he tasted blood where he'd bitten his tongue. For a moment he lay there in the snow, the wind howling above him, the foal motionless against his chest, and he felt the seductive pull of simply staying down, of letting the cold take them both into its numb embrace. Margaret's face came to him then, not as she'd been at the end, wasted by fever and delirious with pain, but as she'd looked on their wedding day, her eyes bright with hope and love and absolute faith in the future they would build together. She had believed in him, in his strength and his determination, and even though she was 8 years gone, James couldn't bear the thought of proving her faith misplaced. He pushed himself upright, gasping at the pain in his ribs, and kept moving. The barn appeared out of the storm like a miracle, its dark bulk suddenly looming where there had been nothing but white chaos. James stumbled through the open doors, nearly weeping with relief, and carried the foal to an empty stall that he quickly lined with fresh hay. The small body was limp now, barely breathing, its eyes closed and its limbs cold to the touch despite the sheepskin coat. James worked with desperate efficiency, stripping away his wet coat and replacing it with dry blankets from the tack room, rubbing the foal's legs and chest to stimulate circulation, clearing its nostrils of mucus that threatened to choke it. The barn was warmer than outside, but still cold enough that he could see his breath, and he knew that wasn't good enough for a newborn that should have been in a heated stable with its mother's warm body to shelter against. He lit every lantern he could find, creating a ring of light and heat around the stall, then ran for the house to wake his housekeeper and get supplies. Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had come west with her husband during the gold rush and stayed after his death, appeared in her nightdress with a speed that suggested she'd already been awake and worrying about the storm. One look at James's face told her everything she needed to know. She didn't ask questions, just disappeared into the kitchen and returned minutes later with bottles, clean cloths, and a mixture of warm milk and molasses that she'd prepared countless times before for orphaned calves and injured animals. Together they worked over the foal, forcing small amounts of the mixture between its lips, massaging its throat to encourage swallowing, wrapping it in heated blankets that Mrs. Chen rotated from the kitchen stove in careful shifts. An hour passed, then two, and still the foal lay motionless, its breathing so shallow that James had to press his ear against its chest to confirm it was still alive. He'd sent two of his hands out into the storm to look for Snowdrop, though he harbored no real hope they'd be able to bring her in before morning. The best they could do was mark her location and hope she survived until the weather cleared enough for a proper rescue attempt. Mrs. Chen brought coffee, strong and black and sweet, and James drank it without tasting it, his entire attention focused on the tiny white form in the stall. He'd delivered hundreds of foals over the years, had saved animals that seemed beyond saving, had developed a reputation for being able to nurse even the weakest creatures back to health. But this felt different somehow, more personal, as if the foal's survival had become tangled up with something deeper in his own soul. Some need to prove that life could still triumph over death, that hope could still bloom in the darkest storms. Just when he was beginning to lose faith, when the first gray light of dawn was starting to filter through the barn's high windows and he was contemplating the grim task of preparing a grave in frozen ground, the foal's eyes opened. They were dark and liquid and utterly beautiful, filled with the confused awareness of new life encountering the world for the first time. The small body shuddered, then the foal lifted its head, wobbling and weak but unmistakably alive, unmistakably fighting to survive. James felt something break open in his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart after Margaret's death, and tears he'd been too proud or too numb to shed for 8 years suddenly spilled hot down his weathered cheeks. Mrs. Chen appeared beside him with more warm milk, her weathered face creased with concern that softened when she saw the foal moving. "Good sign, Mr. Thornton, very good sign." Her English carried the musical lilt of her native Cantonese, and her dark eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from surviving hardship most people couldn't imagine. Baby want to live. Strong spirit in small body. James could only nod, not trusting his voice, as he helped support the foal's head while Mrs. Chen coaxed more of the warm mixture between its lips. This time the baby swallowed eagerly, its pink tongue working against the bottle's nipple with growing strength. Color was returning to its gums, and the terrible stillness that had gripped its small frame was giving way to the normal restlessness of a newborn discovering its body and its hunger in equal measure. They worked together in comfortable silence, these two people who had shared a household for 5 years, without ever speaking of the loneliness that bound them together. Mrs. Chen had lost her husband to a mining accident and her only son to fever, and she understood grief in ways that required no translation. She had watched James retreat further into himself with each passing year, his face growing harder and his heart more carefully guarded, and she had wondered if he would ever find his way back to the man he'd been before sorrow had carved such deep lines around his eyes. Now, watching him cradle the foal with a gentleness she hadn't seen since Margaret's death, Mrs. Chen felt something like hope stir in her own carefully protected heart. The storm raged outside the barn, the wind howling like all the lost souls of the prairie seeking shelter they would never find. But inside the small circle of lamplight, life was winning its battle against the cold. The foal grew stronger with each passing hour, its attempts to stand becoming more coordinated, its cries shifting from weak distress to the demanding hunger of a healthy baby. By the time full daylight arrived, gray and dim through the continuing snowfall, the little white creature was on its feet, wobbling but determined, nursing from the bottle with an enthusiasm that made James laugh out loud for the first time in longer than he could remember. The hands returned from their search just after dawn, their faces grim beneath layers of frost and ice. They'd found Snowdrop where James had left her, but the mare was dead, her body already half buried in snow, her dark eyes frozen open in an expression that might have been peace or might have been pain. She'd fought to the end to get back to her baby, the trail of disturbed snow suggesting she'd tried to rise multiple times before the cold and exhaustion had claimed her. James received the news with a heavy heart, though it was what he'd expected. He'd known the odds when he made the choice to save the foal instead of attempting to move the mare, but knowing didn't make the loss any easier to bear. Tom, the young ranch hand who'd been responsible for securing the horses, stood with his hat in his hands and tears freezing on his cheeks. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton. I swear I checked every stall before the storm hit. I don't know how she got out." James looked at the boy's stricken face and felt his anger dissolve before it could fully form. Accidents happened, especially with heavily pregnant mares who could be clever and desperate in equal measure when labor called them to seek privacy. Snowdrop had probably slipped out while Tom was checking the other end of the barn, drawn by instinct to find a quiet place away from the herd. It wasn't anyone's fault, just the cruel mathematics of nature and timing that governed life on the frontier. "It's all right, son," James said quietly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You did your best. Sometimes that's not enough and we lose animals despite our best efforts. The important thing is, we saved the baby." Tom's face brightened slightly at that, the burden of guilt easing just enough to let relief show through. "Can I see it, sir? The foal?" James led him to the stall, where the baby stood on uncertain legs, its white coat now dry and fluffy, its dark eyes bright with curiosity as it investigated its small world. Tom let out a low whistle of appreciation. "It's the spitting image of its mama. Pure white, not a mark on it. That's rare, that is." The other hands had gathered around, drawn by the sight of new life in the midst of so much death and destruction. The storm had claimed 3 calves found frozen in the south pasture, had torn part of the roof off the equipment shed, and had scattered fencing across half the ranch. But here was this perfect little foal, alive against all odds, a reminder that sometimes hope survived even the darkest storms. "What are you going to call it, boss?" asked Samuel, the oldest hand, a grizzled cowboy who'd been with James since the beginning. James hadn't thought about names, had been too focused on simple survival to consider what came after. But looking at the foal now, remembering the desperate journey through the blizzard, the moment when he'd nearly given up, the tears that had surprised him when those dark eyes had finally opened, he knew there was only one name that fit. "Miracle," he said simply. "We'll call her Miracle." The hands approved with nods and quiet murmurs, and James realized they understood what he was really saying, that this foal represented something more than just a replacement for valuable breeding stock. She was proof that life could emerge from tragedy, that devotion and determination could tip the scales when everything suggested surrender was the only logical choice. Over the following days, as the storm finally blew itself out and the ranch began the hard work of recovery, Miracle became the center of James's world. He moved a cot into the barn so he could be near her at night, rising every few hours to prepare bottles and check her temperature and make sure she was thriving, despite her traumatic entry into the world. Mrs. Chen brought meals to the barn, shaking her head at his devotion but saying nothing, understanding that something important was happening here, some healing that went deeper than the physical care of an orphaned animal. James found himself talking to Miracle as he worked, sharing thoughts and memories he'd kept locked away for years. He told her about Margaret, about their dreams of filling the big house with children who never came, about the terrible winter when fever had taken his wife and left him alone in rooms that echoed with her absence. He described the long years of building the ranch into something successful and respected, the satisfaction of achievement that never quite filled the hollow places in his soul. And he talked about the moment in the storm when he'd held Miracle's limp body against his chest and felt something crack open inside him, some door he'd welded shut after Margaret's death, suddenly swinging wide to let light and pain and possibility flood back in. The Foal listened with the perfect attention of the very young, her dark eyes tracking his face as if she understood every word, her small body pressing against his legs when he sat in the stall, seeking the warmth and security that every orphaned creature craves. There was something almost supernatural about their bond, something that the other hands noticed and commented on in quiet voices when James wasn't around to hear. The Foal followed him everywhere she could reach, crying pitifully when he had to leave the barn for ranch business, settling only when she could hear his voice or feel his hand stroking her neck. James knew it was simple imprinting, the natural response of a motherless baby attaching to the first source of care and comfort it encountered, but it felt like more than that, like some kind of recognition passing between two souls who had both survived storms that should have destroyed them. 3 weeks after the rescue, Dr. William Preston made his regular rounds to the Thornton Ranch, checking on the livestock and earning the generous retainer that James paid him. The veterinarian was a careful man in his 50s who'd trained in Edinburgh before coming west to seek his fortune, and his opinion carried weight throughout the territory. He examined Miracle with thorough attention, checking her legs and lungs and overall condition with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible variation of animal health and illness. When he finished, he straightened with a slight smile and nodded his approval. "She's perfect, Mr. Thornton. Completely healthy, developing exactly as she should despite the difficult start. Whatever you've been doing, keep doing it." James felt relief wash over him, though he'd known in his heart that Miracle was thriving. Dr. Preston leaned against the stall door, his expression thoughtful as he watched James stroke the foal's neck with obvious affection. "I must say, I've never seen you so attached to an animal before. You've always been professional, almost clinical in your approach to livestock management. This is different." James bristled slightly at the observation, uncomfortable with having his emotions examined so openly. She needed round-the-clock care. I couldn't exactly let her die after going through all that trouble to save her. The veterinarian smiled, a knowing expression that suggested he saw right through the defensive words. "Of course not. But I've known you for 10 years, James, and I've watched you manage this ranch with remarkable efficiency and very little sentimentality. You've culled animals that weren't profitable, sold favorites when the price was right, made hard decisions without hesitation. Yet here you are, sleeping in a barn and bottle-feeding a foal that by all rights should have been left to nature's judgment." There was no accusation in the words, just gentle observation, but James felt exposed nonetheless. "What's your point, William?" "My point is that perhaps this little creature is offering you something you've needed for a long time, permission to care about something again, to let your guard down and invest yourself emotionally in an outcome you can't completely control." The words hit closer to home than James wanted to admit. He'd spent 8 years maintaining rigid control over every aspect of his life, building walls around his heart that kept him safe from further loss, but also isolated from any possibility of joy or connection. Miracle had somehow slipped past those defenses, her helplessness and her determination to survive awakening something in him that he'd thought had died with Margaret. The following Sunday, James found himself doing something he hadn't done in months, attending church services in town. He'd avoided the small whitewashed building and its earnest congregation for years, unable to reconcile his anger at God for taking Margaret with the platitudes about divine plans and mysterious ways that well-meaning people offered as comfort. But Mrs. Chen had asked him to drive her to services, as the roads were still treacherous from the storm's aftermath, and he'd found himself unable to refuse. The church was packed, families crowded into pews that creaked under their collective weight, children fidgeting and whispering while their parents tried to maintain proper reverence. Reverend Thomas, a young man barely 30, who'd arrived in town 6 months earlier full of Eastern theological education and Western optimism, delivered a sermon about faith in dark times, about finding light in the midst of storms. James listened with half his attention, the other half occupied by thoughts of miracle back at the ranch, wondering if Tom was remembering to warm the milk properly and check her water. He was so lost in worry that he didn't notice the woman sliding into the pew beside him until her perfume reached him, a delicate scent of lavender and something else he couldn't quite identify. He glanced sideways and felt his breath catch slightly. She was perhaps 35, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple but elegant style, and green eyes that seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. Her dress was well made but not ostentatious, suggesting comfortable circumstances without the need for display. She smiled at him, a brief acknowledgement of their proximity, then turned her attention to the sermon with an intensity that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. James found his own attention wandering from Reverend Thomas's words to study her profile, the delicate line of her jaw, the way she tilted her head slightly when considering a particular point in the sermon. There was something familiar about her, though he was certain they'd never met. He would have remembered those eyes, that particular shade of green that reminded him of spring grass after rain. When the service ended and the congregation rose to file out, exchanging pleasantries and weekly news, James found himself standing face to face with the woman, their exit blocked by the crowded aisle. Up close, he could see fine lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, and a strength in her bearing that suggested she was no stranger to hardship. "Mr. Thornton," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I've been hoping to meet you. I'm Elizabeth Hartwell, the new school teacher. I arrived last month, just before the storm." James took her hand, feeling the firmness of her grip even through the fabric of her glove. "Miss Hartwell, welcome to our community. I hope you're settling in well." "Mrs. Hartwell, actually," she corrected gently. "I'm a widow. My husband passed 3 years ago back in Boston. I came west seeking a fresh start and perhaps some distance from memories that had become more burden than comfort." The honesty of the statement surprised him, as did the understanding he saw in her eyes when she looked at him. Somehow she knew about Margaret, about his own widowhood and long isolation. Small towns were remarkably efficient at sharing such information with newcomers. "I heard about your rescue of the foal during the storm," she continued as they made their way slowly down the aisle. "The children at school have been talking about nothing else. They're calling you a hero." James felt heat rise in his cheeks, uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm no hero. I just did what needed doing." Any rancher would have done the same. Mrs. Hartwell's smile suggested she disagreed but was too polite to argue. Perhaps. But not every rancher would sleep in a barn for 3 weeks to care for an orphaned animal. That speaks to something beyond mere duty. Before James could formulate a response, they were interrupted by a cluster of townspeople eager to welcome the new school teacher and catch up with James, who had become something of a recluse in recent years. He found himself separated from her in the crowd, carried along by conversations about weather and cattle prices and the upcoming spring planting. But as he drove Mrs. Chen back to the ranch, he couldn't stop thinking about those green eyes and the understanding they'd held, the way Elizabeth Hartwell had looked at him as if she saw not just the successful rancher or the tragic widower, but the man beneath those labels, complex and wounded, and still capable of feeling despite his best efforts to remain numb. Back at the ranch, Miracle greeted him with enthusiastic whinnies, her small body pressing against the stall door as she demanded attention and her next bottle. James found himself telling her about the morning, about the sermon, and the new schoolteacher, with eyes the color of spring grass, feeling foolish even as the words tumbled out. The foal listened with her usual perfect attention, and for a moment James could have sworn she understood, that her dark eyes held wisdom beyond her weeks of life. The next day brought an unexpected visitor. Elizabeth Hartwell arrived at the ranch in a hired buggy, her practical traveling dress suggesting this was business rather than a social call. James met her in the yard, wiping his hands on his work pants and acutely aware of how rough he must look compared to her neat appearance. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is a surprise. What brings you all the way out here?" She smiled, but there was nervousness beneath it. "I hope you'll forgive the presumption, Mr. Thornton, but I wanted to ask if you might be willing to bring Miracle to the schoolhouse one day. The children are fascinated by the story of her rescue, and I thought it might serve as an excellent lesson about responsibility and care for living things." James hesitated, instinctively protective of the foal who had become so central to his daily existence. "She's still very young, still fragile in some ways. I'm not sure it's wise to transport her or expose her to a crowd of excited children." "I understand your concerns," Elizabeth said, and the use of his first name felt oddly intimate. "But I think it might also be good for both of you to venture out, to share this remarkable story with people who would appreciate it. Sometimes the best way to honor a miracle is to let others witness it." There was something in her words, some deeper meaning that had nothing to do with foals and schoolrooms, that made James reconsider. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he'd been holding too tightly to this small creature, using her as an excuse to avoid the world beyond his ranch. Perhaps it was time to take a risk, to step out of the careful isolation he'd maintained for so long. "All right," he said finally. "When would you like us to come?" Elizabeth's face lit up with genuine delight. "Friday afternoon, around 2 o'clock. That would give the children something wonderful to look forward to all week." James found himself agreeing, though a part of him wondered what he was getting himself into. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation and second-guessing. James worked with Miracle, getting her accustomed to a lead rope and basic handling, making sure she could walk calmly beside him without startling at unexpected sounds or movements. The foal was remarkably intelligent, learning with a speed that surprised even him, and by Thursday evening he felt confident she could handle the visit without embarrassing him or frightening the children. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of brilliant winter day that made the prairie sparkle like it was dusted with diamonds. James bathed and dressed with more care than usual, choosing his best shirt and newest pants, telling himself it was out of respect for the school children and had nothing to do with the school teacher's green eyes. Mrs. Chen watched his preparations with barely concealed amusement. "You look very handsome, Mr. Thornton. Teacher lady will be impressed." James felt his ears burn. "This isn't about impressing anyone. I'm simply presenting a good example to the children." "Of course," Mrs. Chen agreed, her smile suggesting she believed nothing of the sort. "Is always good to set proper example." The ride to town took 40 minutes, Miracle trotting alongside his horse with the easy grace of a creature born to movement. She attracted attention everywhere they passed, ranchers pausing in their work to admire the pure white foal, children running to fence lines to wave and call out greetings. The schoolhouse sat on the edge of town, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower and windows that caught the afternoon sun. James could hear the excited chatter of children inside as he approached, their young voices rising in anticipation. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway before he could dismount, her face flushed with pleasure and something else he couldn't quite identify. "You came," she said, and there was relief in her voice that suggested she'd half expected him to change his mind. "I gave my word," James replied, swinging down from his horse and taking Miracle's lead rope in hand. The foal pressed against his leg, suddenly shy in this unfamiliar place with so many strange sounds and smells. Elizabeth knelt down, moving slowly and carefully, extending her hand for Miracle to sniff. "Oh, she's beautiful. Even more beautiful than the children described." The foal investigated her cautiously, then apparently decided she was trustworthy and pushed her soft nose into Elizabeth's palm, searching for treats. Elizabeth laughed, a sound that seemed to light up the cold afternoon, and James felt something shift in his chest, some long dormant part of himself stirring to life. "May we come in?" he asked, suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of this venture. "The children are waiting," Elizabeth said, rising gracefully. "They've been impossible to settle all morning. Fair warning, they're going to have 1,000 questions." The interior of the schoolhouse was warm and bright, heated by a pot-bellied stove and lit by windows that Elizabeth had clearly cleaned until they shone. 23 children of varying ages sat at their desks, their eyes wide with wonder as Miracle stepped delicately across the threshold, her hooves clicking on the wooden floor. For the next hour, James found himself transformed into a storyteller, recounting the rescue with more detail and emotion than he'd shared with anyone except the foal herself. The children listened with rapt attention, gasping at the description of the storm, cheering when he found Miracle in the snow, growing solemn when he explained about Snowdrop's death. He talked about the long nights in the barn, the careful feeding schedule, the moment when Miracle's eyes had first opened and he'd known she would survive. Elizabeth stood to the side, watching him with an expression that made his heart beat faster, and he realized she wasn't just seeing the successful rancher or the tragic widower anymore. She was seeing the man who had risked his life for a helpless creature, who had wept over a foal's survival, who had let himself care despite the risk of loss. When the story finished, the children crowded around Miracle, their small hands gentle as they stroked her neck and marveled at her pure white coat. A little girl with braids and missing front teeth looked up at James with serious brown eyes. "Mr. Thornton, were you scared in the storm?" "Terrified," James admitted, and the honesty seemed to satisfy her in a way a brave denial wouldn't have. "But sometimes we have to do things that scare us, because they're the right things to do." Another child, a boy of perhaps 10 with his father's weathered features already showing in his young face, asked the question that cut closest to the bone. "Do you think Miracle's mama knew you would save her baby? Is that why she let you take it?" James felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "I'd like to think so. I'd like to think Snowdrop understood that I would do everything in my power to give her daughter the life she couldn't provide herself." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Miracle's soft snuffling as she investigated the classroom with growing confidence. Elizabeth moved to stand beside James, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. "That was beautifully said," she murmured, her voice for his ears alone. "You've given them more than just a story about a foal. You've shown them what it means to be responsible for something vulnerable, to honor the trust that's placed in us." James looked down at her, at the understanding in those green eyes, and felt the carefully constructed walls around his heart develop another crack. "Who are you, Elizabeth Hartwell? Why do I feel like you see right through me?" She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Because I know what it's like to build walls around your heart, to convince yourself that staying safe means staying alone. I've been doing the same thing for 3 years, telling myself that I was content with my books and my students, that I didn't need anything more than the purpose my work provided." "And what changed?" he asked, though he thought he might already know the answer. "I heard a story about a man who rode out into a killing storm to save something small and helpless, who chose compassion over self-preservation, who let himself care even though caring meant risk. She paused, her eyes holding his with an intensity that made the noisy classroom fade away. It made me think that perhaps I'd been wrong about the price of opening your heart again, that maybe the real danger isn't in caring but in refusing to care at all. Before James could respond, they were interrupted by one of the older students asking if Miracle could visit the school again, and the moment passed. But as he prepared to leave, Elizabeth walked with him to the door, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture that felt both casual and momentous. "Thank you for coming today," she said. "You've given the children a memory they'll carry with them for years." "And what about you?" James heard himself ask. "What will you carry from today?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge openly. Elizabeth's cheeks colored slightly, but she didn't look away. "Hope," she said simply. "I'll carry hope that second chances are possible, that storms eventually pass, and that sometimes miracles come in unexpected forms." James rode home in the fading afternoon light, Miracle trotting contentedly beside his horse, and found himself thinking about green eyes and auburn hair, about the way Elizabeth's hand had felt on his arm, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to spend the rest of his life alone in a house that echoed with absence. Mrs. Chen took one look at his face when he arrived home and smiled her knowing smile. "School visit go well?" "Very well," James admitted. "The children were wonderful." "And teacher lady?" "Also wonderful," he said, and couldn't quite suppress his own smile. Mrs. Chen nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already known. "Good. It's time for you to live again, Mr. Thornton. Miss Margaret would want that for you. She would want you to be happy." That night, as James settled Miracle in her stall and prepared for bed in the barn, as had become his habit, he found himself thinking about Elizabeth's words, hope that second chances are possible. For 8 years he'd told himself that his chance at love had died with Margaret, that asking for more would be greedy or disloyal or simply foolish. But holding Miracle as she drifted off to sleep, feeling her warm breath against his hand, remembering the sound of children's laughter and the understanding in Elizabeth's eyes, James began to wonder if perhaps he'd been wrong. Perhaps the real dishonor to Margaret's memory wasn't in loving again, but in refusing to embrace the life she would have wanted him to live. The following week brought an invitation that surprised James more than he cared to admit. Elizabeth sent a note via one of her students, written in elegant script that reminded him of his mother's careful penmanship. The message was simple but carried weight beyond its few words. She was hosting a small dinner party on Saturday evening for several of the town's leading citizens and would be honored if he would attend. James stared at the cream-colored paper for a long moment, acutely aware that accepting meant stepping back into the social world he'd abandoned after Margaret's death, meant exposing himself to the well-meaning questions and pitying looks he'd spent years avoiding. But he also remembered the way Elizabeth had looked at him in the schoolhouse, the understanding in her green eyes, the suggestion that perhaps isolation wasn't the only way to honor grief. He sent his acceptance the next morning, along with a jar of Mrs. Chen's preserved peaches and a note of his own that was far less eloquent than Elizabeth's had been, but carried its own kind of honesty. Saturday evening found James standing before his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie for the third time and feeling more nervous than he had in decades. Mrs. Chen had laid out his best suit, the one he'd purchased in Denver 5 years ago for a Cattlemen's Association dinner, and had worn exactly twice since. The dark wool was still in excellent condition, tailored to fit his broad shoulders and tall frame, and he had to admit he looked presentable, almost like the successful businessman people said he was, rather than the work-worn rancher he felt himself to be. "You look very handsome," Mrs. Chen said from the doorway, her approval evident. "Teacher lady will be very impressed." "This isn't about impressing anyone," James protested, though the protest was growing weaker each time he made it. I'm simply fulfilling a social obligation. Mrs. Chen's smile suggested she knew better. Of course. Social obligation. That why you changed tie 3 times and asked me to press shirt twice. James couldn't help but laugh at himself at the transparent nature of his nervousness. All right, perhaps I want to make a good impression. There's no crime in that. No crime at all, Mrs. Chen agreed. It's good to care about such things again. Miss Margaret would be happy to see you dressing up for pretty lady. The mention of his late wife might have stung a year ago, but now James found only comfort in it. Margaret had possessed a generous heart, had wanted him to be happy even when her own happiness was being stolen by fever and pain. In her final days, she had made him promise not to mourn forever, not to let grief turn him into a ghost, haunting the rooms of their home. He'd broken that promise for 8 years, but perhaps it wasn't too late to finally honor it. The dinner party was held at the small house Elizabeth rented from the church, a tidy cottage on the edge of town with a garden that would be beautiful come spring. James arrived precisely on time, clutching a bottle of wine he'd selected from his cellar and feeling like an awkward schoolboy rather than a 42-year-old man of considerable means and experience. Elizabeth opened the door herself, and James felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She wore a deep green dress that brought out the color of her eyes, her auburn hair styled in a way that was both elegant and approachable. But it was her smile that truly transformed her, warm and genuine, and just nervous enough to make him feel less foolish about his own anxiety. "Mr. Thornton, I'm so glad you could come. Please come in." The interior of her home was as he'd expected, filled with books and thoughtful touches that spoke of a woman who created beauty and comfort wherever she lived. The other guests were already assembled, Dr. Preston and his wife, Reverend Thomas and his sister who served as his housekeeper, and Mayor Collins with his wife who owned the town's most successful mercantile. They were people James knew but had kept at arm's length for years, and their surprise at seeing him in a social setting was evident, even though they were too polite to comment directly. The evening passed more pleasantly than James had anticipated. The conversation ranged from town politics to literature, from agricultural prospects to the latest news from the East. Elizabeth proved to be a gracious hostess, drawing out even the quietest guests and somehow making everyone feel their contributions were valued. James found himself discussing his ranch's breeding program with genuine enthusiasm, debating the merits of various authors with Reverend Thomas, even laughing at Mayor Collins's stories about the early days of the town. But throughout the evening he was most aware of Elizabeth herself, the way she listened when others spoke, the intelligence that shone in her eyes, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her like warmth from a well-tended fire. She had clearly suffered, clearly knew loss and loneliness, but she hadn't let it break her or turn her bitter. Instead, she had transformed her pain into compassion, using her own experience of hardship to better understand and help others. After dinner, as the other guests settled into the parlor for coffee, Elizabeth drew James aside under the pretense of showing him a book she thought might interest him. In the relative privacy of her small library, surrounded by shelves filled with volumes on every subject imaginable, she turned to him with an expression that was both hopeful and uncertain. "I'm glad you came tonight. I wasn't sure you would." "Why wouldn't I?" James asked, though he knew the answer. "Because I've heard how you've avoided social gatherings for years, how you've kept yourself separate from the community except for business necessity. I was afraid my invitation might seem presumptuous, that you might resent being pushed towards something you'd chosen to leave behind." James considered her words, recognizing the truth in them. A month ago, he would have resented such an invitation, would have found a polite excuse to decline, and then retreated back into his comfortable isolation. But something had changed, and he suspected it had as much to do with the woman standing before him as it did with the foal sleeping peacefully back at his ranch. "I won't pretend this is easy for me," he said carefully. I've spent a long time building walls around myself, convincing myself that staying separate was the same as staying safe. But recently I've begun to wonder if perhaps I was wrong. If perhaps the real safety comes from connection rather than isolation. Elizabeth's eyes were bright with understanding. "What changed your mind?" "Miracle," he said simply. Watching her fight to survive, caring for her when every logical part of my brain said it would be easier to let nature take its course, feeling something crack open in my chest when her eyes finally opened and I knew she would live. She reminded me that caring about something, being vulnerable to loss, that's not weakness. It's the only thing that makes life worth living. The words hung between them, laden with meaning that went far beyond discussions of horses and survival. Elizabeth took a small step closer, close enough that James could smell the lavender in her hair, could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of smiles and sorrows shared in equal measure. "I lost my husband to a building collapse in Boston," she said quietly. "He was an architect, was inspecting a construction site when the scaffolding failed. One moment I was a happily married woman planning our future. The next I was a widow sorting through his belongings and trying to understand how life could change so completely in a single instant." "I'm sorry," James said, and meant it. "I know that doesn't help, but I am genuinely sorry for your loss. Thank you." She smiled, though sadness lingered in her eyes. "I spent 2 years in Boston after his death, teaching at a girls' academy and telling myself I was content with my books and my work. But I wasn't really living, just existing, going through motions that had lost their meaning. Coming west was my attempt to find myself again, to discover if there was still a version of Elizabeth Hartwell who could embrace life instead of simply enduring it." "And have you found her?" James asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I think I'm beginning to," she replied, and her hand found his, her fingers curling around his palm with a certainty that took his breath away. "I think meeting you and hearing about Miracle helped me see that second chances aren't something to be feared, but something to be grateful for." They stood there in the library, hands clasped, the sounds of conversation and laughter drifting from the parlor where the other guests were engaged in their own discussions. James knew he should pull away, should maintain the careful distance he'd preserved for so long. But Elizabeth's hand in his felt right in a way nothing had felt right since Margaret's death, and he found himself unable or unwilling to break the connection. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted. "I don't know if I can be what you might need or want." "I'm not asking for promises or declarations," Elizabeth said gently. "I'm simply asking if you might be willing to explore the possibility that we could be friends, that we could support each other, as we both try to find our way back to living instead of merely surviving." "Friends," James repeated, testing the word and finding it both safer and more loaded with potential than any romantic declaration. "Yes, I think I could manage friendship." Her smile was radiant. "Good. Then perhaps you and Miracle might visit the school again. The children haven't stopped talking about her, and I confess I've been hoping for an excuse to see you both again." The admission made James's heart beat faster. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it, aware that they'd been absent from the party long enough to spark speculation if they stayed away much longer. "I'd be happy to arrange another visit. Perhaps we could make it a regular occurrence, bring in different animals from the ranch so the children can learn about livestock management and animal care." Elizabeth's eyes lit up. That would be wonderful. Practical education combined with the kind of character lessons that can't be taught from books. It's exactly what these children need. They returned to the parlor separately, maintaining proper decorum. But James caught Dr. Preston's knowing smile and realized their absence hadn't gone unnoticed. The rest of the evening passed in pleasant conversation, but James was acutely aware of Elizabeth across the room, the way she laughed at Mayor Collins' jokes, the grace with which she served coffee and managed her guests. When the party finally ended and James prepared to leave, Elizabeth walked him to the door with the other departing guests. In the confusion of farewells and thanks, she managed to press a small note into his hand, her fingers lingering against his palm for just a moment longer than necessary. James waited until he was home, until he'd checked on Miracle and settled into his chair by the fireplace, before unfolding the note. The words were brief, but carried the weight of confession. Thank you for taking a chance on friendship tonight. I know it wasn't easy for you, just as hosting a dinner party and pretending my heart wasn't racing every time you spoke wasn't easy for me. Perhaps we're both braver than we give ourselves credit for. Until next time, Elizabeth. James read the note 3 times, his calloused fingers tracing the elegant script, before carefully folding it and placing it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. The admission that she'd been nervous too, that she'd felt the same pull of attraction and possibility that had been making his pulse quicken all evening, was both terrifying and exhilarating. He'd thought himself too old, too damaged by grief to feel this way again, yet here he was at 42, experiencing the same flutter of anticipation and uncertainty he'd felt courting Margaret 2 decades earlier. The weeks that followed established a pattern that gradually became the highlight of James's existence. He brought Miracle to the schoolhouse every Friday afternoon, along with various other animals from his ranch. One week, it was a gentle older mare who let the children practice grooming and basic handling. Another week, he brought a litter of barn kittens whose mother had died, teaching the children about bottle feeding and the responsibility of caring for orphaned animals. The students absorbed every lesson with enthusiasm, but James suspected they learned as much from watching him interact with Elizabeth as they did from any formal instruction. The two of them moved around each other with a careful choreography, maintaining appropriate distance in front of the children while their eyes held conversations their mouths couldn't speak aloud. Elizabeth would ask a question about animal husbandry that gave James an opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge and passion for his work. James would praise her teaching methods and the way she'd transformed even the most reluctant students into eager learners. They were like two people learning to dance together, finding the rhythm that worked for them without stepping on each other's carefully protected hearts. On a bright April morning, nearly 3 months after the storm that had brought Miracle into his life, James received devastating news. Dr. Preston arrived at the ranch unannounced, his face grave, and asked to speak privately. In the barn office where James kept his breeding records and financial ledgers, the veterinarian delivered the kind of news that shattered carefully constructed hopes. "I've been doing some research on pure white horses," William said, his voice heavy with regret. "There are genetic issues that sometimes accompany that coloring, particularly in horses born from traumatic circumstances." James felt his stomach drop. "What kind of issues?" "Vision problems mostly. Sometimes they develop a degenerative condition that leads to blindness. I've noticed Miracle bumping into things occasionally, favoring her hearing over her sight when you approach. I'd like to do some tests, but I think we need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that she may go blind, possibly within the next year or 2. The words hit James like physical blows. Miracle, his perfect white foal who had survived against all odds, who had cracked open his carefully guarded heart, might be going blind. The unfairness of it, the cruel mathematics of survival that gave with one hand while taking with the other, made him want to rage against the universe and its arbitrary cruelties. "How certain are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I won't know for sure without more extensive examination, but the signs are concerning. The way she startles when approached from certain angles, the clouding I'm seeing in her eyes when I examine them closely. I'm sorry, James. I know how much she means to you." After Dr. Preston left, James sat alone in the barn office, his head in his hands, trying to process this new development. He'd thought the hard part was over. thought that saving Miracle from the storm meant she was safe, that their future together was secure. But life, as he'd learned too well with Margaret's death, didn't make such guarantees. Suffering and loss could return in new forms, could find you even when you thought you'd paid your dues to grief. That evening, instead of his usual visit to the schoolhouse, James sent a note canceling Friday's lesson, claiming unexpected ranch business. It was a coward's excuse, and he knew it, but he couldn't face Elizabeth's perceptive green eyes, couldn't bear to have her see the fear and pain he was trying unsuccessfully to hide. He spent the night in the barn with Miracle, holding her head in his lap and memorizing every detail of her face, the exact shade of her dark eyes that might soon see nothing, the delicate curve of her ears, the soft white muzzle that pushed against his chest, seeking comfort. If she was going to go blind, he wanted to be there for her, wanted to help her adapt to a world without vision. But the thought of watching her struggle, of seeing her reduced and limited by a condition he couldn't prevent or cure, broke something in him that he'd thought was healing. Elizabeth appeared at the ranch the next morning, arriving in the same hired buggy she'd used for her first visit. James saw her from the barn and considered hiding, considered sending Mrs. Chen to make excuses, but he'd never been good at running from hard conversations, even when every instinct screamed at him to protect himself from further vulnerability. She found him in Miracle's stall, and one look at his face told her something was terribly wrong. "James, what's happened? Is Miracle all right?" He told her about Dr. Preston's diagnosis, about the possibility of blindness, about the unfairness of saving a life only to watch it diminish in slow increments. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, everything he'd been holding inside since the veterinarian's visit, pouring out in a rush of fear and anger and helpless frustration. Elizabeth listened without interruption, her hand finding his and holding tight as he spoke. When he finally fell silent, exhausted by the force of his emotions, she simply held him, her arms coming around him with a strength that belied her slender frame. "I'm so sorry," she said against his chest. "I know how much she means to you, how she's helped you find your way back to living again. This must feel like the universe is punishing you for daring to care." "That's exactly what it feels like," James admitted, his arms tightening around her. "Every time I let myself hope, every time I allow myself to love something, it gets taken away. Margaret, and now possibly Miracle. Maybe I'm not meant to have these things. Maybe I should have stayed behind my walls where it was safe." Elizabeth pulled back enough to look up at him, her green eyes fierce with conviction. "Do you regret rescuing her? Do you wish you'd left her in that storm to die, spared yourself this pain?" "No," James said immediately. "Never. Even knowing what might happen, I wouldn't change that choice." "Then you already know the answer," Elizabeth said gently. "Love always involves risk. Caring about something means making yourself vulnerable to loss. But the alternative is to live a half-life, to exist without really experiencing anything worth remembering. Miracle gave you back your ability to feel, to connect, to hope. Whatever happens with her vision, that gift remains." James looked down at her, at this remarkable woman who had appeared in his life at exactly the moment he needed her most, who understood grief and loss, but had chosen hope anyway. "How did you get to be so wise?" "I'm not wise," she replied with a sad smile. "I'm just someone who's learned the hard way that protection from pain isn't the same as living. When David died, I retreated into myself for 2 years, convinced that keeping everyone at a distance was the only way to avoid being hurt again. But all I accomplished was to add loneliness to my grief, to compound my loss by refusing to let anyone else matter. Coming here, meeting you, watching you care for Miracle with such devotion, it reminded me that being vulnerable isn't weakness, it's courage." They stood together in the stall, Miracle nuzzling against them both, seeking the affection and attention she'd come to expect. James felt the weight of his fear begin to shift, not disappearing, but becoming more bearable when shared with someone who understood. "What if she does go blind?" he asked. "What if I have to watch her struggle and suffer, unable to fix it?" "Then you'll help her adapt," Elizabeth said with quiet certainty. "You'll teach her to navigate by sound and smell and touch. You'll protect her and guide her and love her through whatever challenges come. And you won't be alone in it because I'll be here too, helping however I can." The promise, simple and direct, cracked something open in James's chest. For 8 years he'd carried his burdens alone, convinced that independence was strength and that accepting help was admission of failure. But Elizabeth was offering partnership, was suggesting that perhaps the real strength came from allowing others to share the weight of difficulty. "I don't deserve you," he said, the words escaping before he could think better of them. Elizabeth's smile was gentle but firm. "That's not for you to decide. I'm not some prize you earn through suffering or good behavior. I'm just a woman who's choosing to stand beside a man she admires, who she's come to care about more than is probably wise given how recently we met." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying in its implications. James knew he should pull back, should maintain the careful friendship they'd established, should protect them both from the risk of deeper involvement. But he was tired of being careful, tired of letting fear dictate his choices. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I care about you too, more than I thought I was capable of caring about anyone after Margaret. You've brought light back into my life, made me remember what it feels like to anticipate someone's company, to think about someone when they're not there. I don't know what the future holds, don't know if Miracle will go blind or if I can be the kind of man you deserve, but I know I don't want to face whatever comes without you beside me." Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "That's all I needed to hear. We'll face it together, James. The blindness if it comes, the challenges ahead, all of it. Together." They kissed then, standing in a barn filled with the warm smell of hay and horses, with Miracle watching them with her dark eyes that might soon see nothing. It was a gentle kiss, tentative and sweet, carrying the weight of grief acknowledged and hope cautiously embraced. When they finally pulled apart, both trembling slightly, James felt something settle in his chest, some piece of himself that had been lost since Margaret's death, finally clicking back into place. Dr. Preston's fears were confirmed 3 weeks later after extensive examinations in Denver. Miracle was developing a degenerative condition that would lead to complete blindness, probably within 18 months. The specialists offered no cure, no treatment that would slow the progression, just the cold facts delivered with professional sympathy that did nothing to ease the blow. James received the news standing in the Denver hospital's waiting area, Elizabeth beside him with her hand gripping his so tightly he could feel her pulse racing against his palm. The journey back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts, the weight of certainty somehow heavier than the burden of possibility had been. But as the familiar landscape rolled past the train windows, as they drew closer to home, and the small white foal who had changed everything, James felt his despair begin to transform into something else, something that felt like determination mixed with defiance. Miracle was going blind. That was a fact, unchangeable and harsh. But she was alive, and she had value beyond her vision, and he would be damned if he let this diagnosis diminish the miracle of her survival. When they arrived home, Mrs. Chen met them at the door with tea and sympathy, but James waved both away gently. He needed to see Miracle, needed to hold her and somehow communicate that nothing had changed, that she was still precious and loved, regardless of what challenges lay ahead. The foal greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, pushing her soft muzzle against his chest and whickering for attention. James wrapped his arms around her neck and breathed in her warm horse smell, feeling tears prick his eyes for the second time in as many months. Elizabeth stood in the stall doorway, watching them with an expression that held both sadness and something fiercer, something that looked like pride. "She's beautiful, you know. Not despite her condition, but including it. She's survived a blizzard birth, hypothermia, losing her mother, and now she'll survive this too. Because she has you." James looked up at her, this remarkable woman who had somehow become essential to his existence in a matter of months. "And I have you." "Yes," Elizabeth said simply, stepping into the stall and placing her hand on Miracle's neck beside his. "You have me. We'll figure this out together." The next months were a study in adaptation and innovation. James began training Miracle to navigate using verbal commands and touch cues, teaching her to respond to his voice with the same reliability other horses responded to visual signals. He mapped out the ranch in his mind, identifying potential hazards and either removing them or teaching Miracle to recognize and avoid them through careful repetition and patience. Elizabeth became a constant presence at the ranch, arriving after school each day to help with Miracle's training and to simply be there as James worked through his fear and frustration. She proved to have a gift with the foal, her gentle voice and patient manner complementing James's more direct approach. Together they created a support system that allowed Miracle to continue developing despite her deteriorating vision. The townspeople watched this unfolding drama with interest and varying degrees of understanding. Some thought James was being foolish, wasting time and resources on an animal that would never be truly useful. Others saw something noble in his devotion, though they expressed it in the kind of pitying tones that made James grit his teeth. But there were also those who understood on a deeper level, who recognized that this was about more than just a horse going blind. Mayor Collins stopped by one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss town business but clearly driven by different motivations. He found James working with Miracle in the training paddock, teaching her to navigate a simple obstacle course by voice command alone. The older man watched for several minutes before speaking, his weathered face thoughtful. "You know what I see when I look at you in that foal, Mr. Thornton?" James paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What's that, Mayor?" "I see a man who's learned that worth isn't determined by perfection, that value doesn't diminish just because something can't do what it was originally bred for." The mayor's eyes were kind, but direct. "I see a man who's teaching this whole town a lesson about compassion and commitment, even if he doesn't realize that's what he's doing." The words settled over James like a warm blanket, unexpected validation from a source he'd never anticipated. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The mayor nodded, then added with a slight smile, "I also see a man who's courting our school teacher in the most roundabout way possible, using a blind foal as an excuse to spend time together. Might be simpler to just ask her to marry you and be done with it." The suggestion made James's heart skip. Marriage. He hadn't let himself think that far ahead, hadn't dared to hope that what was growing between him and Elizabeth could lead to something so permanent. They'd been courting in the formal sense for only a few months, though it felt like they'd known each other far longer. Was it too soon? Too presumptuous to think she might want to tie her life to his permanently? That evening, as he and Elizabeth sat on the porch watching Miracle graze in the paddock, her movements growing more cautious as her vision continued to fade, James found himself thinking about the mayor's words. Elizabeth had been sitting beside him through every difficulty, had stood with him when the diagnosis was confirmed, had helped him transform despair into purpose. She'd integrated herself into his life so seamlessly that he couldn't imagine facing the future without her steady presence beside him. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "there's something I need to ask you." She turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the sunset's golden light. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease of long practice. "I'm listening." I know we haven't been courting long, not by traditional standards, and I know I come with complications, a ranch that demands constant attention, a blind foal that requires special care, grief that still surfaces at unexpected moments. But these past months with you have been the happiest I've been since Margaret died, and I can't imagine going back to the loneliness I lived with for so long." He paused, gathering courage, then continued. "I'm not offering you an easy life or a simple romance, but I'm offering you partnership, respect, and love that grows stronger every day. Elizabeth Hartwell, would you consider becoming my wife?" The silence that followed felt eternal, though it could only have been seconds. Elizabeth's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling, that radiant expression that transformed her entire face and made James's heart skip. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, James Thornton. Not for an easy life or a simple romance, but for partnership and respect and love that I feel growing stronger every day too." They sealed the promise with a kiss as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that neither of them saw, too focused on each other to notice the beauty surrounding them. Miracle lifted her head from grazing, her failing eyes somehow finding them across the distance, and she whinnied softly as if in approval. The engagement was announced at church the following Sunday, to the delight of most of the congregation and the knowing smiles of those who'd seen it coming from the moment Elizabeth had first walked into James's life. Reverend Thomas offered his congratulations and his services for the wedding ceremony, which they planned for early summer when the prairie would be green and growing, when the world would be full of promise and new beginnings. The weeks leading up to the wedding were busy with preparations and adjustments. Elizabeth moved some of her belongings to the ranch gradually, claiming the bedroom that had once been Margaret's with James's blessing and Mrs. Chen's enthusiastic assistance in making it her own. She brought her books and her teaching materials, her small treasures and personal touches that transformed the house from James's solitary domain into a shared home. Miracle's blindness progressed as the specialists had predicted, until she could see only shadows and vague shapes in bright light. But she adapted with remarkable resilience, learning to trust James's voice completely, following him through the ranch with a confidence that belied her disability. She knew the barn layout by heart, could find her feed and water without assistance, and had even begun to serve as an unexpected teacher herself. Elizabeth brought her students to the ranch for special lessons, showing them how Miracle navigated her world through sound and scent and memory. The children watched in fascination as the blind foal moved through obstacle courses, responding to James's verbal cues with precision and trust. They learned about adaptation and resilience, about how disabilities didn't define worth, about the power of patience and love to help overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. One student, a shy girl named Anne who struggled with a severe stutter, found particular inspiration in Miracle's story. She began spending afternoons at the ranch, helping care for the foal and practicing her speech in the non-judgmental presence of an animal who listened without criticism. Over weeks, her confidence grew, her stutter becoming less pronounced as she learned that communication took many forms and that her value wasn't diminished by her difficulties. "This is what I mean about teaching," Elizabeth said to James one evening, as they watched Anne brush Miracle with careful strokes. "The greatest lessons aren't always the ones that come from books. Sometimes they come from watching courage in action, from seeing how love can transform obstacles into opportunities." James pulled her close, marveling at how this woman had not only captured his heart, but had helped him see his life and his work in new ways. "You've taught me as much as I've taught anyone. You've shown me that second chances are possible, that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that opening yourself to love again isn't betraying the past, but honoring it." The night before their wedding, James found himself unable to sleep, his mind churning with thoughts of the future and memories of the past. He rose quietly and made his way to the barn, where Miracle stood in her stall, her head drooping in the relaxed posture of equine sleep. At the sound of his footsteps, she lifted her head and turned toward him, her movements guided entirely by her ears rather than her now sightless eyes. "Hey there, girl," James said softly, entering the stall and running his hand along her neck. "Couldn't sleep either." Miracle pushed her nose against his chest, her breath warm and sweet, and James felt emotion well up in his throat. This Foal, this impossible survivor who had cracked open his carefully guarded heart, had given him back his life in ways he was still discovering. Without her, he might never have found the courage to let Elizabeth in, might never have learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness but the foundation of genuine connection. "Thank you," he whispered against Miracle's neck. "Thank you for fighting to survive that night in the storm. Thank you for teaching me that love is worth the risk of loss, that caring for something fragile doesn't make you weak but makes you fully human. I don't know if you understand, but you saved me as much as I saved you." The barn door creaked and James looked up to see Elizabeth silhouetted against the moonlight, wrapped in a shawl against the cool night air. "I had a feeling I'd find you here," she said, moving to stand beside him. "Nervous about tomorrow?" "Nervous, excited, grateful, terrified," James admitted. "All of it at once." "Is that normal?" Elizabeth laughed softly. "I think it's perfectly normal for two people who've both loved and lost to feel conflicted about opening themselves up to that possibility again. But I also think we're braver than we give ourselves credit for." She placed her hand on Miracle's neck beside his, their fingers touching in the darkness. "This little one taught us both that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most difficult circumstances, that beauty and tragedy can coexist, that survival itself is a form of grace. Tomorrow, when we stand before our friends and neighbors and promise to share our lives, we'll be honoring everything that brought us to this moment, including the losses that shaped us." James turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I loved Margaret with everything I had, and when she died, I thought that capacity for love died with her. But you've shown me that the heart is more resilient than I believed, that it can break and heal and break again and still find the courage to open. I love you, Elizabeth, not as a replacement for what I lost, but as a wholly new chapter, a different kind of love that honors my past while embracing our future." Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face, silver in the moonlight. "And I love you, James. I love your strength and your gentleness, your devotion to this small creature who needed you, your willingness to risk your heart again despite knowing how much it can hurt. Tomorrow I become your wife, and I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges come, to share your joys and your sorrows, to help carry the weight of difficulty and multiply the celebration of triumph." They held each other in the barn with Miracle standing peacefully beside them, three survivors bound together by circumstance and choice, by loss endured and hope cautiously embraced. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect June morning that seemed designed for new beginnings. The ceremony took place on the ranch, in a meadow that Elizabeth had chosen for its view of the rolling prairie hills and the way the afternoon light painted everything golden. Chairs had been set up for the guests, simple wooden benches borrowed from the church, and Mrs. Chen had decorated everything with wildflowers picked from the surrounding grassland. The entire town seemed to have turned out for the occasion, ranchers in their Sunday best standing alongside shopkeepers and their families, children in starched dresses and uncomfortable collars fidgeting in the front rows. But the most honored guest stood beside James at the altar, a small white foal with a wreath of flowers around her neck, her blank eyes somehow conveying the same joy that radiated from everyone present. Reverend Thomas began the ceremony with words about love and commitment, about the courage required to open your heart after loss, about the way grief could transform into gratitude when given enough time and grace. But James barely heard the familiar phrases, too focused on Elizabeth as she walked toward him on Mayor Collins's arm, her green eyes locked on his face with an intensity that made everything else fade away. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that moved like water in the gentle breeze, her auburn hair crowned with wildflowers that matched those adorning Miracle. She was beautiful, but more than that, she was real and present. And choosing him, choosing their life together with full knowledge of his scars and limitations and the complicated grief he still carried. When she reached the altar and took his hands, James felt the rightness of the moment settle into his bones like truth, too fundamental to question. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thomas began, "we are gathered here today to witness the joining of James Thornton and Elizabeth Hartwell in holy matrimony. This union represents not just the coming together of two individuals, but the triumph of hope over despair, of love over fear, of faith in tomorrow, despite the sorrows of yesterday." The ceremony proceeded with traditional vows and the exchange of rings, simple gold bands that represented promises made with full hearts and clear eyes. But when it came time for James to speak his personal vows, he found himself looking not just at Elizabeth but at Miracle standing beside them, at the gathered community that had supported them both, at the vast prairie stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "6 months ago, I was a man who had convinced himself that safety lay in isolation, that the only way to avoid pain was to avoid connection. Then a storm came, and a small white foal fought for her life in the snow, and everything I thought I knew about strength and vulnerability got turned upside down. Saving Miracle taught me that caring for something fragile doesn't diminish you but enlarges you. That love is always worth the risk, even when we know how badly it can hurt. And then you walked into my life with your green eyes and your understanding heart and your own carefully earned wisdom about loss and survival. And you showed me that second chances aren't something to fear, but something to embrace with gratitude and courage. I promise to love you with the same devotion I've shown this small creature, to stand beside you through whatever storms may come, to share my strength when you need it, and accept yours when I'm weak. I promise to honor your past while building our future, to never take for granted the gift of your presence in my life, to grow old beside you with grace and humor and abiding affection." Elizabeth's vows were equally moving, spoken with tears streaming down her face, but her voice steady and sure. "James," she said, "when I came to this town, I was running from memories that had become too painful to bear. I thought teaching school and keeping myself separate would be enough, that I could find purpose without risking my heart again. But then I heard about a wealthy rancher who rode into a blizzard to save a dying foal, who cared more about preserving life than protecting himself, and I began to wonder if perhaps I'd been wrong about the price of loving again. Meeting you, watching you nurture Miracle through every challenge, seeing the way you transformed grief into devotion and fear into purpose, it gave me courage I didn't know I possessed. You've shown me that strength isn't about staying invulnerable, but about choosing to be vulnerable anyway, about opening yourself to hurt, because the alternative is a half-life that honors nothing and no one. I promise to be your partner in all things, to share the work of the ranch and the joys of our home, to help you through the difficult days and celebrate the triumphant ones. I promise to love Miracle as I love you, with patient devotion and unwavering commitment. I promise to fill our home with laughter and learning, to create a life together that honors both our pasts while embracing every possibility of our future." When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the assembled guests erupted in applause and cheers. James kissed Elizabeth with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and futures anticipated, while Miracle whinnied softly beside them, as if adding her own blessing to their union. The celebration that followed was everything a frontier wedding should be. Simple food prepared with care, Music provided by local musicians with more enthusiasm than polish. Dancing that went on until the stars came out and the night air grew cool. James and Elizabeth moved through it all in a state of euphoric disbelief, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people who had watched them both struggle through grief and had witnessed their unlikely romance bloom into something lasting and real. As the party wound down and guests began to drift away toward their homes and wagons, James found himself standing with Elizabeth at the edge of the meadow, Miracle grazing peacefully nearby, her movements confident despite her blindness. The moon was rising over the prairie, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow, and James felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced in 8 long years. "What are you thinking?" Elizabeth asked, leaning against his shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of a woman who already knew his silences as well as his words. "I'm thinking about how much can change in 6 months," James replied. "How a single storm, a single choice to ride out into the cold, can set in motion events that transform everything. If I'd stayed inside that night, if I'd told myself the risk was too great or that one foal wasn't worth the danger, I wouldn't be standing here with you now. I'd still be alone in that big house, convincing myself I was content with isolation." Elizabeth turned to face him, her hands finding his in the darkness. "But you did ride out. You made the hard choice, the compassionate choice, and it led you here. That's not random chance, James. That's character. That's who you are at your core. Someone who acts when others would hesitate, who chooses life even when death seems easier." The first months of their marriage were an adjustment for both of them, learning to share space and decisions, navigating the small conflicts and compromises that came with merging 2 independent lives into one partnership. Elizabeth continued teaching, riding into town each morning and returning each afternoon to help with Miracle's care and the endless work that came with running a large ranch. James found himself consulting her on decisions he'd always made alone, discovering that her perspective often revealed angles he'd missed, solutions he hadn't considered. Mrs. Chen watched their growing partnership with satisfaction, pleased to see the house filled with laughter and conversation again, to hear voices raised in good-natured debate rather than echoing in empty rooms. She prepared meals that brought them together around the kitchen table, created spaces for them to build their life together, and tactfully retreated to give them privacy when privacy was needed. Miracle continued to adapt to her blindness with remarkable resilience. By the time she turned 1 year old, she could navigate the entire ranch from memory, could find her way from barn to pasture and back without assistance, could even run when the mood struck her, her ears swiveling to catch sounds that guided her path. She became something of a local celebrity, people traveling from neighboring counties to see the blind white mare who moved through the world with such confidence, who proved that disability didn't mean inability. Elizabeth incorporated Miracle into her teaching with James's blessing, using the foal to illustrate lessons about adaptation and perseverance, about the many forms intelligence could take, about the difference between sight and vision. Students who struggled with their own challenges, whether physical limitations or learning difficulties or social anxieties, found inspiration in Miracle's story. They saw that being different didn't mean being less, that obstacles could be overcome with patience and creativity and support from those who cared. Anne, the girl with the severe stutter, continued to spend afternoons at the ranch, and under Miracle's influence and Elizabeth's gentle encouragement, she began to find her voice. By the end of the school year, she was reading aloud in class without hesitation, her confidence transformed by the understanding that communication took many forms and that her worth wasn't determined by her fluency. The second winter of James and Elizabeth's marriage brought another fierce storm, the kind that rattled windows and piled snow in drifts that buried fence posts. But this time, when the wind howled and the temperature dropped, James wasn't alone in the house, listening to the silence. Elizabeth sat beside him in front of the fireplace, her head on his shoulder, while they read together and talked about plans for spring planting and her students' progress in the Foal. One of their mares was due to deliver in February. When James rose to check on the horses, Elizabeth came with him, bundled in her warmest coat and holding the lantern, while he ensured every animal was secure and comfortable. Miracle greeted them with her usual enthusiasm, untroubled by the storm that raged outside her warm barn. She'd learned to trust that James would always return, that safety and care were constant she could depend on, regardless of what chaos might swirl beyond her limited world. "That's what love looks like," Elizabeth said, watching James check Miracle's water and adjust her blanket, showing up consistently, providing security even when circumstances are difficult, being the stable center that others can rely on. "You've given her that, and you've given it to me too." James pulled Elizabeth close, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair, marveling at how this woman had transformed his life so completely. "And you've given me purpose beyond mere survival, shown me that building a life means more than just accumulating success or proving you can endure hardship alone. You've taught me that the real measure of a life well lived is the connections we forge, the love we share, the way we show up for each other when showing up is hard." Spring arrived with its usual dramatic flair, the prairie transforming from brown dormancy to vibrant green seemingly overnight. Wildflowers carpeted the hills in waves of color, and the air filled with the sounds of new life, calves and foals being born, birds returning from their winter migrations, the whole world waking up and reaching toward the sun. Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant in early April, the news delivered by Dr. Preston with a smile and instructions to take things easy during the demanding final months of the school year. James received the information with a mixture of joy and terror, memories of Margaret's failed pregnancies and the children they'd hoped for, but never had, threatening to overshadow the miracle of new life growing in Elizabeth's womb. But Elizabeth faced his fear with characteristic directness. "I'm not Margaret," she said gently but firmly. "I'm healthy and strong, and Dr. Preston sees no reason to expect complications. You can't let the past steal the joy of this moment, James. You can't let fear of what might happen prevent you from celebrating what is happening." She was right, as she so often was, and James made a conscious choice to embrace hope instead of dwelling on anxiety. He found himself planning for their child's arrival with enthusiasm that surprised him, converting one of the upstairs bedrooms into a nursery, building a cradle from prairie oak with the same care he'd used for Miracle's, talking to Elizabeth's growing belly about the ranch and the horses and the life that awaited their son or daughter. Miracle seemed to sense the change in the household, her behavior around Elizabeth becoming almost protective, following the pregnant woman around the ranch and standing calmly when Elizabeth needed to rest against her warm bulk during afternoon walks. The baby arrived on a mild September evening, a daughter with Elizabeth's green eyes and James's dark hair, her cries filling the house with sound that was both demanding and beautiful. They named her Hope because that's what she represented, proof that life could bloom from the ashes of loss, that love could find you even when you'd given up looking for it, that second chances were real and precious and worth every risk. As James held his daughter for the first time, her tiny hand curling around his finger with surprising strength, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. A storm that had seemed like pure destruction had actually been the catalyst for everything good that had followed. Saving Miracle had cracked open his heart, making space for Elizabeth to enter. Elizabeth had given him back his life, had shown him that grief could coexist with joy, that honoring the past didn't mean refusing the future, and now Hope, this small, perfect creature who depended on him completely, represented the ultimate triumph of love over fear, of faith over despair. The years that followed were full and rich, marked by the ordinary challenges and extraordinary joys that came with building a life together. James and Elizabeth added 2 more children to their family, a son named David after Elizabeth's first husband, and another daughter they called Margaret in honor of the woman whose death had nearly broken James, but whose memory he'd learned to carry with grace instead of crushing grief. Miracle lived to the remarkable age of 23, spending her days in peaceful retirement at the ranch, surrounded by the children who had grown up hearing the story of her rescue and her resilience. She remained a teacher to the end, showing everyone who encountered her that limitations didn't define worth, that adaptation was possible, that love could sustain you through the darkest storms. When she finally passed peacefully in her sleep one spring morning, the entire community mourned, understanding that they'd lost not just a horse, but a symbol of everything that made their frontier town strong, the compassion and determination and refusal to give up on vulnerable creatures that defined them at their best. James and Elizabeth buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch, marking the spot with a simple stone that read, "Miracle, born in storm, lived in love, taught us all to see with more than eyes." On the day of Miracle's burial, as James stood beside her grave with Elizabeth's hand in his and their 3 children gathered around them, he thought about all the ways one small white foal had changed the course of his life. She'd taught him that love was always worth the risk, that caring for something fragile enlarged rather than diminished you, that hope could survive even the most brutal storms if you were willing to fight for it. And she'd led him to Elizabeth, to their children, to this full and beautiful life he'd never imagined possible during those dark years after Margaret's death. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and James felt gratitude wash over him like a benediction. He'd ridden out into a killing storm to save one small life, never imagining that in doing so he was actually saving his own. Miracle had been her name, but she'd been more than that. She'd been a teacher, a catalyst, a bridge between grief and healing, between isolation and connection, between the man he'd been and the man he'd become. As they walked back to the house together, James carrying their youngest daughter and Elizabeth holding the hands of their other 2 children, he knew that Miracle's legacy would live on, not just in the stories they would tell, but in the way they lived their lives with compassion and courage, with hearts open to possibility despite knowing how much love could hurt, with faith that storms eventually passed and that miracles could come wrapped in the most unexpected packages.